On August 3rd, 2014, US and Afghan Special Operations Forces deployed to Charkh District, about 60 miles south of Kabul, to clear Taliban from the area. There's nothing unusual about this. US Special Operations Forces often accompany Afghan soldiers on these sorts of missions. I was in Afghanistan at the time of the operation. A source called me to tell me that soldiers had beaten a man to death. He also told me it was too dangerous to go to Charkh, so I drove as close as I could to the provincial capital. This is the video I shot just days after the operation.
ساعت 7 بجه روز و 8 بجه روز بود که مردم هیچ خبر نداشت که امریکا با اردوی ملی اومد سرای کور محاصره کرده. در خانه مردم تا شده، موتر مردم را به زور می‌کشید، دستار تا اومدن.
اولا رفتیم که یک نفر شهید شده، موتر زده بود، سراچه سفید بود. بازینو را زدن برادر اونمو از پشت به سر موتر زده بودن. اونم یک زنک.
At first it seemed like another footnote in the war. But after I returned home to Copenhagen, more details began to emerge from my contacts in Charkh. Then 6 months later, the UN came out with its 2014 report citing civilian casualties. I found a short reference to the operation in it.
Operation resulted in 28 civilian casualties, 15 deaths and 13 injured.
15 dead. How could 15 civilian deaths from a joint US and Afghan military operation go by almost unnoticed to the outside world? The report said that the international and Afghan security forces denied civilian casualties. I knew I needed to go back to Afghanistan if I had any chance of finding out the truth. In 2009, 8 years into the war in Afghanistan, the United Nations started trying to systematically document civilian casualties. 2014 marked the deadliest year on record. I was back in Afghanistan to piece together what I could about the 15 civilians who were killed on August 3rd, 2014. I'd been given photographs of some of the people who died. One of those is Farid Mohammed, a driver with 4 children. His mother had been with him on the morning of the operation. It was still too dangerous for me to go to Charkh, so she came to meet me on the outskirts of Kabul. It is extremely rare for a rural Pashtun woman to meet with a man she's not related to.
Salam alaikum. Salam alaikum.
She told me that on the morning of August 3rd, she and her son were driving to visit her sister in a village in Charkh District for the Eid holiday. She saw some soldiers on the roads, but says it was peaceful out.
نزدیک خانه همشیریم که رسیدیم دم سر موترمو فایر کردن. من بچه‌ام خود دیگه دم یک فایر دیگه سر خدا بالا نکرد. فرید گفتم صدا کردم جوابم نداد. دیگه اونجا من فهمیدم گفتم دیگه فیصله شد. بخی دم نداشت. شوهرم هم زخمی شد. من خودم هم دستم اینت شده. دیگه موضوع کردیم دیگه نفهمیدیم.
شما دیدن کسی را که طرف شما فایر کرد؟
نه ما ندیدیم.
Amana spent a month in hospital recovering from the loss of her finger and wounds to her abdomen. Her son Farid Mohammed died, leaving behind his widow and 4 children.
جوان بود اینم کشته شد دیگه ما دیگه چی بگویم بیادر جان. حیف ما میکنم زن اولادش در میدان ماند. جوان زار.
بچه شما و شوی شما عملی طالبان ارتباط داشت؟
نه به خدا این بچه بود این موتروان بود خلاص. شویم خیلی قدی سفید از تو دیگه چی میکنه قد طالب.
بعد از این واقعه که شد کسی از حکومت از ولایت یا از اردو به تماس همراه شما شد؟
نه کس دقیقه کس نیست بیادر جان کی باز خواست سوال میکنه یکی جوانا کشته میشه کی پرسان سوالش میکنه.
I learned from the UN that of the 15 civilians killed during the military operation, 4 of them were boys.
یا سنش 11 بوده نه؟
One of them was 11-year-old Ayman Khan.
سوالی شده مکتب که داخلش کرده بود. دیگه سوال چند داخل است؟
چند سال پیش است؟
4 سال پیش. خب 7 4 11 مهینه 4 سال پیش.
از یک کی گرفته بود؟
یک سیاهی بچه ها گرفته بود. مکتب گرفته بود.
Ayman Khan's 13-year-old brother Zawar Shah told me what he remembers from that morning. The 2 boys were out collecting wheat together.
ای کمی بالا که تاس که گفتم بیشی کمی گفتم بیشی ما خود انداختم که گرم بیم سر این چه خفتید ای که افتید ما که تو سعی کردم این سعی کردم خون بود تو خون بود سعی کردم یکی نمقدر چیز دیگه مغز چیزوش بود سعی کردم بیادرم شیش شدم یه ما اینجا خود انداختم.
اقا نزدیک شما بود که خود دیدهشو نمیتونستی؟
دیده نمیتونستم صداشو میشنیدم.
شنیده نمیتونستن که شما اشتکا بوده؟
خود آواز ما رو میشنید نزدیک بود.
Zawar Shah told me that he lay down beside his brother to hide, afraid that he would be targeted by the soldiers on the ground or by the aircraft flying overhead.
وقتی که ما خواب بودم طیاره جیت فایر میکرد سر ما بالا نمیتونستیم. دیگه پدرم که اومد که تا میتونیم گفتم نه گفتم اونجا خیلی باش منتظر باش گفتم خواه.
Their father Nauros Khan tried to come and collect his son's body.
صدا میکنیم او اسکر استی هر کس کی استی فایر نکو که متاشیم بچه رو برداریم هیچ کس جواب نمیده کل دمی قد سنگار یک دوش هم دیدم که فنگوش پاکوش مونم پوست خواهو همینجا ما صدا کردم ای که می صدا کردم فایر کرد.
It was 3 hours, Nauros Khan said, before he could reach his sons.
ما که رفتم دسترش کساله شدم دیگه سعی میکنم که نمقه اونجا موضوع سرش که مویشم ده کرد افتاده گیم همورم دمو قدمو کشش موندم او را یک نفر دیگه گرفت او را موندم دمو قبر دفن کردم کردیم.
چرا شما فکر میکنید که برادرت یا شد کردن؟
ساعت خود اتر میکردم خنده میکردم سرش چیزو که باش خنده کردم یک چند دقیقه.
While reporting this story, I interviewed over 30 eyewitnesses and family members of civilians who had been killed during the military operation. But I wanted to find out more about who was responsible. I scheduled an interview with the United Nations office that had published the brief report about the death. But just a few hours before we were due to meet, they pulled out. They told me that they stood by their findings, but wouldn't give me an on-camera interview. I was bitterly disappointed. I was able to track down a journalist who told me that the then president, Hamid Karzai, had sent an envoy to investigate the civilian death.
So this guy is the investigator.
دا سفیری چې له کابل نه د دغه موضوع تحقیق او حقیقت یابۍ لپاره راغلی و د چرخ خلکو سره نږدې وکتل.
The presidential envoy promised that the civilian death would be looked into thoroughly.
او گفت واقعا در اینجا ظلم صورت گرفته و هر کس که این کار کرده یا مرتکب شده او به پنجه قانون سپرده میشه.
But the family members I spoke to told me that the promises made at the meeting were not kept. I tried to reach the presidential envoy several times. He didn't return my calls. But there was one official investigation that did take place. It happened not because of any official process, but simply because of the tenacity of one man. Mohammed Khan, an engineer from Charkh. His brother Mohammed Razik was killed during the operation, and Mohammed Khan was determined to get justice for his death.
ولی را گفتیم که ولی صاحب تو چی کار کردی؟ چه شده این نفره؟ میگه والا از دست ما پرا نیست. گفتم چرا؟ میگه نمیشه. حرکت کردیم سوی کابل. ای که قانون برای ما معلوم بود. میخواستیم به کجا بریم، از کجا بگیریم، چی رقم کنیم.
On the morning of the operation, Mohammed Khan said Charkh seemed quiet. There were military aircraft flying above at a high altitude, but he said that was normal. Mohammed Khan said that he and his brother Mohammed Razik were out driving when they saw 3 women crying on the side of the road beside an injured man. Khan would later find out that the injured man was a member of the Taliban. Mohammed Razik got out to see what was going on, and they were suddenly surrounded by Afghan special forces.
یکدم سر بیادرم شروع کرد. ام برادرزاده شروع کردن. دیوار کنار دیدیم که یک دم پیدا شد، ما تعجب آور شدیم، بسیار بر ما تعجب. پریدیم از موتر. وقتی که از موتر میپریدیم، اینجا یک سرباز سلیم داریم. میگه دستا تا بالا کن. ما دستای خود بالا کن. دستای خودی که بالا کردیم تراشی کرد. و بیادر خود میبینیم که اونا کتی قنداقمو و کتی میلیک توفنگ، کتی قنداق توفنگ، کتی لغت، کتی مشت، اونا اردو را زده را ایستن. ایرا که بگیرین که بیادر ما را دیگر نزنین، شما حق ندارین، ما را دیگر دستای ما را پشت سر بسته کرد. بعد از او برد ما را.
یک همکار ما چرخ رفته بود دیگه فیلم برداری کرد یک جای که مردم میگفتن اونجا شما را بندی کرده بود.
The brothers were taken to the house of a local doctor where the soldiers were detaining people.
دمی جای شما را بود؟
بله دمی جای ما بود. اینجا بود. دی خانه بود.
ما این دروازه دیادتان است؟
این دروازه دیاد ما هستن. هم دروازه بود. یکی ما زیاد نفر را از این دروازه بردن. کاش میکنه همین تو میگیره و داخل چاردوالی تخته میکنه. یگان تا دیگر 200 300 400 نفر شاید همین چاردوالی جمع شده باشه. زدن و کوبیدن برادر خود میشنیدیم. 3 نفر بودن اونجا. اونا زیر شکنجه لطکوب خود گرفته بودن. 3 نفر بودن. اونا چه غفیق و فریاد از اونا را ما میشنیدیم. اینی عکسش ببین، اینی عکسش بسیار با وحشت وره کشته، بسیار با وحشت. اینی عکسش است که مو چشمش نه مو فلج کرده.
بله.
چشمش کشیده، چشم کتی سیخت زده بود، یک سیخی فلزی بوده.
بله. برادرتان که لط میکرد امریکایی‌ها بودن دیگه سیل میکردن؟
امریکایی‌ها لط نکردن، بلکه امریکایی‌ها مشاهده میکردن، سیل داشتن و خنده داشتن. هیچ ما اصلا سیل کردیم که امریکایی چرا دو مداخله نمیکنه. کدام مداخله نمیشد.
Mohammed Khan was detained in the doctor's compound all day. It wasn't until evening that he was allowed to see his brother. The soldiers had asked the doctor who owned the compound to take a look at Mohammed Razik.
دکتر استاد بود. دکتر گفتم که چطور است؟ این قسمتش یک ذره بسیار وخیم صدا داشت. دکتر گفتم چطور است؟ میگی از بین رفته.
I had tried to reach the doctor who tended to Mohammed Razik as he took his last breath, but he refused to talk to me about what had happened. But his son Mansour, who had also been there that day, came to Kabul to meet me.
There he is. سلام علیکم. خوب هستین شما؟ تشکر از آمدنتان. How come it's not possible for your father to talk with us about it?
شاید یاد از چه خصوصی میترسد که کدام دسیسه یک برمجور میشد یا از طرف طالب یا از طرف حکومت کدام دسیسه برمجور نشد.
Mansour told me that during the night, Afghan soldiers came into his house and occupied it.
استراحت کردم باز زمان که نمی داخل شد نمی دو بای شب اومد کدام چی نکردم نترسیدم داخلیا بود گفت دستاتون بالا بگیرین دروازه رو باز کنین و ما داخل میشیم.
The soldiers told Mansour that they would hold people in his family's house for questioning.
او بعد 8 بای شب 8 بجه روز 9 بجه روز مردم منطقه رغن کردن از چهار اطراف آوردن داخل خانه کردن باز اونا اونجا بندی کردن و
Mansour says he saw Mohammad Razik and 2 other men being beaten by Afghan soldiers.
لاتش میکردن که امروی سیخش میزدن امروی چوب بود امروی خشت بود امروی سنگ بود چیزی که در گیرشون میامد امروی مزود لات کوب میکردن.
Can you tell me whether it was the foreign or the Afghan forces who were beating Razik?
نه داخلیا بود افغانیا بود که لات کوب میکردن خارجی بیخی دسته نداشتن خارج امریکایی هم خنده میکرد امریکایی خودم زمانی که یا سنگ بالم کرد یا چوب بالم میکرد یکی که میزد باز امریکایی یکم لبز چین میکردن میگفتن گفت باز یک 3 نفر امریکایی دایی بم بود یک 3 نفرشون دو بم بلند ما بود باز او سر از او صدا میکردن که میگفت وار خلاص کن خوش خلاص نمیکرد باز امر نمیکردن باز یه میگفت گد میزدن نه خلاص.
I was back in Copenhagen, but I couldn't get what the doctor's son had told me out of my head. A man beaten to death by Afghan soldiers with American Special Operations Forces laughing in the background. Finally, there was a breakthrough. Wali Mohammed, the military investigator who had looked into Mohammad Razik's death, agreed to talk to me on the phone. Wali Mohammed spent a month investigating the case. 7 Afghan commandos were tried and convicted for their involvement in Mohammad Razik's murder, including a company commander who was sentenced to 18 years in prison.
دیگه امریکایی‌ها متوجه بودن از این واقعه که همی عسکرای افغانی محمد رازق لط میکردن.
ما اطمینان داریم که اینا متوجه بودن دیگه ای که کدامش شنیده کدامش نشنیده به این ترتیب ما از اینا حرف نداشتیم که تحقیق کنیم.
According to my sources, the US forces on the ground that day were Navy SEALs and an ODA unit of Army Special Forces. The Navy SEALs were deployed to the village where Mohammad Razik was beaten to death. I wanted to find out why they hadn't intervened to stop the beating, and what they knew about the fate of the other 14 civilians who were killed that day. Fault Lines contacted the US Department of Defense and the Special Operations Joint Task Force in Afghanistan. They both referred us to NATO's mission in Afghanistan.
Najib, Resolute Support has not received any formal allegation from the government.
I didn't know exactly what they meant by no formal allegations.
Civilian casualties.
We followed up and asked them if they'd received any reports of civilian casualties from the August 3rd operation. That was over a month ago. We're still waiting for their answer. I couldn't get any information from the US about their involvement in the operation. But I was able to track down an Afghan lieutenant, Abdul Shafiq, who was a commander on the ground on August 3rd. Over the phone, I asked him about the US's role in the operation.
تثبیت هدف هو برای ما میکنن توسط طیاره بی پیلوت تثبیت هدف میکنن که شما در این ساحه برید در این ساحه برید
خیوا ایتو امرای شما چی میگه جنگ نمیکردن فایر مثال و عملیات ایتو مستقیم میکردن
But when I asked him about the other 14 civilians who had died that day, he told me he didn't know anything about them.
گفتن علی مردم چرخ و علی مردمایی که اونجا شکایت کردن که از ما نفر ملکی کشته شده و اینی کشته شده و این کشته شده این کشته شده به خاطر یک امتیاز دادن برای مردم اودمو ولسوالی چرخ بود که اون مردم بتونن به حج روان بکنن.
With some Afghan officials denying civilian casualties and others breaking their promise to uncover what happened in Charkh. And with the US military stonewalling us, it felt like neither the Afghans or the US were interested in getting to the truth.
Alan Grayson speaking.
US Congressman Alan Grayson sits on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He agreed to talk with me over the phone to discuss my findings.
The UN, they've reported that there were 15 civilian deaths in this area. According to the sources that we spoke to, the civilians that weren't killed in crossfire.
You understand that by the time of last summer, generally speaking, the Americans weren't involved in any live fire incidents, that they had delegated that to the Afghans, and as you explained earlier in this call, were simply acting as, quote, advisors.
I told him about Mohammad Razak's case, that US forces were allegedly watching as Mohammad Razak was beaten to death, but did not intervene to stop it.
Normally, when such an incident occurs, there is in fact an investigation by the US military. Whoever the witnesses were, whether US forces or otherwise, it's tragic that no one intervened, but let's not equate watching an incident like that with perpetrating it.
Congressman Grayson, thank you very much for taking your time to listen.
What I did find out was that for US forces on the ground in Afghanistan, there is no legal obligation to intervene. Even if a civilian is being tortured and beaten to death in front of them by Afghan soldiers. They are, however, supposed to report the crime. The US military wouldn't tell us if even that smallest of obligations was carried out. It seems remarkable that 15 Afghan families can lose loved ones in a joint US-Afghan operation. And over a year on, 14 remain in the dark as to exactly what happened. Noruz Khan still doesn't know which soldier fired the bullet that killed his 11-year-old son, or in fact, why.
بچم بو ما چه کردیم؟ تفنگ داشتیم، تاک سرد شده بود، فایر سرد شده بود، کدوم ظلم سرد شده بود. این مهم است. تنها برای من مهم نیست. برای کل منطقه ما، برای کل ملت ما، برای کل وطن ما مهم است. ما هر کدوم ممکن تو صدای خدا نکشیم، ما خب برباد است مالیم. ما خب مجبور هستیم صدای خدا بکشیم. که چرا که ظلم است؟